Story 1. It was a quiet afternoon when I retrieved the mail, nothing unusual, just the usual assortment of bills and catalogs. But then, buried beneath the pile, I found something that stopped my heart cold, an old, worn postcard. Its edges were frayed, the paper yellowed with age, as though it had been handled countless times. The address was familiar, my childhood home, the house I hadn't set foot in for over a decade. My frown deepened as I flipped the postcard over, expecting a message from a long-lost relative or an old friend. But what I saw written on the back made my blood run cold. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was neat, precise, each letter formed with eerie deliberation. But the message? That sent a chill down my spine. The words described a memory I knew well, too well. It was a moment from my childhood, one I hadn't thought about in years. I had been no more than 8, playing in the backyard of our old house with my younger sister. We had been chasing each other, laughing, running circles around the old oak tree that stood in the center of the yard. The postcard captured the scene perfectly, down to the rustling leaves in the wind and the scent of grass after a fresh rain. But there was one thing that struck me: I had never shared this moment with anyone. How could someone else know it so vividly? The message continued, as though the writer had been an invisible observer in my past. It recounted another private moment, a memory shared only between my sister and me. We had been sitting on the porch, eating ice cream when I dropped mine on the ground. My sister had laughed, and I had scolded her playfully. The postcard captured this scene too, in haunting detail: the flavor of the ice cream, the color of the porch swing, the fading sunlight as evening approached. I turned the postcard over again, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no return address, no signature, just the same unnerving message. My fingers trembled as I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. Who would send something like this? Why? The handwriting seemed strangely familiar, yet I couldn't place it. It wasn't the kind of writing I recognized from anyone in my past. No family members, no friends, just this stranger's words, recounting moments I thought only I knew. I placed the postcard on the kitchen table and went to make myself a cup of tea, trying to calm my nerves. But my thoughts kept circling back to that postcard, to the feeling of being watched for years. Had someone been following us? How could they know those details? The wind in the trees, the scent of the rain. It was as if they had been there, lurking just out of sight. That evening, I decided to visit my childhood home. The house had been sold years ago, but the neighborhood still felt like a part of me. When I arrived, I was struck by how small the house seemed now, how different. The new owners had painted it white, and the yard was neat, too tidy. I stood for a moment, staring at the familiar front door, trying to shake the unease that gripped me. I rang the doorbell, unsure of what to say to the new owners. A middle-aged woman answered, her smile polite but cautious. I explained that I had once lived there and asked if I could take a quick look around, just to relive some memories. She hesitated but agreed. Inside, the house smelled of fresh paint and new furniture. It didn't feel like home anymore, it felt foreign. I walked through the rooms, trying to recall where I used to play, where I had laughed with my sister. I stopped in the living room, staring at the spot where our old couch used to sit. The walls felt empty now, stripped of their warmth. The new owners had rearranged everything, but I could still see the shadows of my childhood in the corners of the rooms. I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been here before, watching, taking note of every little detail. As I left, the woman waved goodbye, and I felt an odd sense of relief. The postcard still haunted me, its meaning unclear, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The house had once been a place of safety, but now it felt haunted, by memories, by eyes I couldn't see, but couldn't escape. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling sense of dread. I replayed the postcard in my mind over and over, trying to decipher it, to understand who would send such a thing. I asked around, old neighbors, childhood friends, anyone who might know something, but no one had seen anything strange. No one had sent it. The mystery deepened, and I found myself becoming obsessed, checking the mailbox daily, hoping for an answer. But none came. Then, one evening, as I was cleaning out an old drawer, I stumbled across a notebook, a childhood journal I'd completely forgotten about. I flipped through the pages, and my breath caught in my throat. There, scrawled across the pages, was the same handwriting from the postcard. My own. But I had no memory of writing it. No memory of seeing the journal before that moment. And certainly, no memory of ever sending that postcard. The chilling thought crept into my mind, one that I couldn't shake: who had been writing my memories for me? And why did I feel like I was living in a story someone else had written? Story 2. It started innocently enough. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Late at night, when the house was still and silent, I would hear soft, almost imperceptible footsteps. I live alone and always double-check the locks before bed, so the thought of someone sneaking around in my house seemed absurd. But as the days passed, those footsteps grew more frequent, and the sense of unease that crawled over me grew darker, more suffocating. It always started after midnight, just as I was drifting into a light sleep. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking softly on hardwood floors, would echo from the hallway. I'd sit up in bed, straining my ears, trying to listen more clearly. But every time I moved or tried to get up, the sound would stop, leaving me with nothing but the quiet hum of the night. Yet, when I tried to dismiss it, the footsteps would return the next night, as if mocking my attempts to ignore them. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old building, nothing more. But these sounds were deliberate, measured steps, as though someone was pacing between rooms, moving from one to the next. I would hear them come down the hallway toward my bedroom, and I'd hold my breath, hoping they'd stop. Sometimes, they'd linger right outside my door, as if someone was waiting, listening. But there was never a knock, no voice, no indication of anyone being there. One night, my curiosity, my fear, pushed me to confront it. I stayed up later than usual, determined to catch whatever was making that noise. The clock ticked past midnight, and there it was again, the soft padding of footsteps. This time, I didn't wait for them to stop. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. The sound seemed to come from just around the corner, near the living room. I was sure I'd find someone there, but when I turned the corner, the room was empty. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, heart pounding, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The house felt unnervingly still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My pulse quickened, and I rushed to turn on every light in the house, scanning each room meticulously. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the windows and doors again, locked, just as I had left them. Still, the footsteps didn't stop. Every night, they returned, always at the same time, following the same pattern. They would start at the far end of the house and move slowly toward my bedroom. I began locking my door at night, hoping that would make a difference, but the sound never ceased. It felt as though whatever was walking outside my door was waiting for me to open it. In a last-ditch effort, I decided to leave a recorder in the hallway, hoping to capture something, anything, that would explain what was happening. I placed it on a table just outside my bedroom door, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. The next morning, I listened to the recording. At first, there was nothing, then, just after midnight, the footsteps began. They were clearer now, each step slow and deliberate. The sound moved closer and closer until it stopped right outside my door. Then, in the dead silence of the recording, I heard something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. And then, a whisper. A whisper of my name. My blood ran cold. There was no mistaking it, the voice on the recording was mine. The footsteps, the sigh, the whisper, they came from somewhere deep within the house. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could it be my voice? I had been alone. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and dread. I checked every room again, hoping for some clue, some sign of forced entry. The locks, the windows, even the attic, everything was intact. I called a friend, desperate for someone to reassure me, but they brushed it off as stress or exhaustion. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what the recorder had captured. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I sat in my bedroom, staring at the door, waiting for the footsteps to begin. When the clock struck midnight, they came again, soft, deliberate. I didn't wait this time. I leapt from the bed, grabbed my flashlight and rushed into the hallway, my heart in my throat. I moved quickly, my light flickering across the walls, but when I reached the end of the hall, there was no one there. I checked every room, every closet, every corner of the house. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. The house was unnervingly quiet. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again, a soft sigh, followed by the faint whisper of my name. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The voice was coming from the walls themselves, as if it was inside them, echoing through the empty spaces. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't alone. Something was here. Something that moved in the shadows, walking silently through the walls, waiting until the moment I least expected. And every night, no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't find the source. All I could do was listen and wait, trapped in a house that no longer felt like a home. It was a prison, and the footsteps would never stop. Stroy 3. One evening, as I mindlessly scrolled through my social media feed, a friend request popped up. The name attached to the profile was unfamiliar, and the profile picture was nothing remarkable, just a blurry image of a sunset over the ocean. Random friend requests weren't unusual, so I almost ignored it. But something tugged at me, an unsettling feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, urging me to take a closer look. I clicked on the profile, searching for any hint of who this might be. The account was new, with only a handful of posts and no mutual friends. The photo albums were empty, and the personal details were sparse. But then, I saw it, a single post, a photo that stopped me cold. It was a picture of me, taken during a vacation I had taken years ago to a small coastal town. I could immediately recognize the beach in the background and the hotel balcony where I had stayed. But what made the photo so chilling was that I had never posted it. I hadn't shared a single photo from that trip, and I had no memory of anyone taking it. A cold wave of fear washed over me as I stared at the image, my heart pounding. How could this stranger have a photo of me from a trip I'd taken so long ago? The angle suggested the photo had been taken from a distance, as if someone had been watching me, unseen. I scrolled through the rest of the profile, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. No posts, no comments, just a few more pictures of me, all taken from different angles and places, all without my consent. Panic began to crawl under my skin as I sat back, my pulse quickening. These photos weren't recent, they were from years ago, from places I'd visited before I even had a social media account. I hadn't shared those memories online, and certainly hadn't made any of them public. I tried to think, to recall who might have taken these photos, but no one came to mind. The faces in the pictures were strangers to me. I had no recollection of anyone being with me on these trips. A deep, chilling sense of being stalked settled into my bones. Someone had been following me, had been taking pictures of me without my knowledge. The thought alone made my skin crawl. Who was this person? How had they gotten these photos? It was as if they knew everything about me, where I'd been, the moments I'd experienced. I quickly blocked the profile, hoping to sever any connection, but as soon as I did, I noticed something else. The profile picture had changed. It was now a close-up of my face, taken during the same vacation at a dinner I had shared with friends. I was smiling, completely unaware that someone was capturing the moment. Panic surged through me. How could they have access to this photo? I had only shared it with a small group of friends, none of whom had ever posted it anywhere. My mind raced. Had someone been watching me for years, collecting photos from my life? Or worse, had they somehow hacked into my personal files? The feeling of exposure and vulnerability was suffocating. I felt like I was no longer in control of my own memories. I checked my phone's gallery, praying for any clue that might explain this. Everything seemed normal, no strange files, no new photos hidden away. I rechecked my social media accounts, but everything appeared secure. The friend request had come from a profile with no friends, no history, no trace of activity. Whoever this person was, they had created this account solely for this purpose, to reach out to me, to send a chill down my spine. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone from my trip had taken the photo and shared it without my knowledge. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. These weren't just random images of me. They were intimate, private moments, memories I had never shared, moments no one should have had access to. The idea that someone had been collecting them, without my permission, made my stomach churn. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking my social media accounts, scrutinizing every new request and message. I kept expecting to see another one, another photo of me I hadn't shared, another chilling reminder of someone's watchful presence. But nothing came. The silence was worse than the photos themselves, leaving me in a constant state of unease. I tried to talk to a few close friends about it, but no one had any answers. They suggested it might just be a coincidence, that someone had simply stumbled across an old picture of me online. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something darker, something wrong about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that this person was out there, watching me. Weeks passed, and the memory of the strange friend request began to fade into the background, though I never fully let go of the unease. I tightened my social media security, changed my passwords, but the nagging fear that someone knew too much about me never truly left. One night, as I mindlessly scrolled through my feed again, I froze. A new post from a friend I hadn't spoken to in a while appeared. They had shared a photo from a recent trip. I stopped scrolling, my eyes locked on the image. In the background, barely noticeable at first, was a figure. A figure that looked a lot like me. I zoomed in, my breath catching in my throat. There I was, standing at the edge of a crowded market in a city I'd visited just months ago. And behind me, just out of focus, was the same stranger. The same person who had sent me that friend request. They were there, watching. Waiting. Story 4. It all began on a lazy Sunday afternoon, a day that should have felt peaceful. I was at the park, snapping photos of the trees, the birds, and the setting sun. The air was perfect, and I wanted to capture the fleeting beauty of the moment. I took a shot of a tree, its golden leaves swaying gently in the breeze. But when I glanced at the photo on my phone, something felt wrong. In the background, near the far edge of the frame, there was a figure. A person, standing still, staring directly at the camera. I blinked, zoomed in, and my heart skipped. The figure was blurry, almost a smear of motion, but I could tell something was off. The face. It was strangely familiar, yet foreign, like a reflection of myself, but distorted. The posture, the way they stood, wrong, unnerving, unnatural. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just a passerby who'd wandered into the shot, unnoticed. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't the case. The next day, I went to the beach, hoping the salty air would clear my head. I snapped more photos, of the waves crashing against jagged rocks, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the water. When I checked the photo later, I froze. There, at the water's edge, was the same figure. This time, it was unmistakable. A person, wearing my clothes, standing at a distance. My stomach churned. How could it be? I looked around the beach in a panic, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. I dismissed it as nothing more than my imagination playing tricks. But when I got home and went through the rest of the photos from the past week, my blood ran cold. The same figure appeared again and again. In a photo at a cafe, they stood just behind me, their presence looming. In another, they were reflected in a window, barely visible but undeniably there. Each time, they looked more like me, yet, something was always wrong. Their posture, the way they moved, it wasn't quite right, as if I were seeing a distorted version of myself. My mind raced. Could someone be following me? I had no idea. But the more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. How could they move so quickly, so silently, appearing in so many photos without me ever noticing them in person? They were always just out of sight, lurking, watching, waiting. As the days wore on, the sightings didn't stop. They grew more frequent, and the figure began to invade my peripheral vision. I'd catch a glimpse of them, just out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to face them, nothing. It was as if they were always near, but never fully present. The feeling gnawed at me, like a dark presence hovering just beyond my reach. I tried to avoid taking pictures altogether, but the figure remained. Always in my thoughts, lurking in the corners of my mind. One night, after a long day at work, I found myself compulsively scrolling through my photos again, my hands trembling. And there it was. The figure, standing in my living room, just behind the couch. I knew I had taken the photo myself, but I had no memory of anyone being there. The terror hit me like a freight train. Was I losing my mind? Was I seeing things? Or was I being haunted by something I couldn't understand? I wanted to tell someone, to scream, but I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that I wouldn't believe myself. I decided to confront whatever it was head-on. I grabbed my camera and went back to the places I'd seen the figure before, the park, the beach, the cafe. Each time, I took photo after photo, hoping to capture some answer, some clue. But the figure was always there, just out of focus, standing in the background, watching. But then, in one photo, something changed. The figure wasn't just standing still, they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, walking toward me. I could barely breathe. The figure was no longer distant. It was getting closer, coming for me. My heart hammered in my chest, and a primal fear seized me. I knew it was only a matter of time before the figure stepped out of the frame and into my reality. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, feeling the cold weight of their presence. I could picture them in my mind, standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their face. Familiar, yet twisted, like a cracked mirror. The next morning, I woke with a sickening sense of dread, the kind you can't shake. I checked my phone, as I had done every morning, but this time, there was something different. The figure was in my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed. I hadn't taken that photo. They had been waiting for me to wake up. I didn't know how they had gotten there, or what they wanted, but one thing was certain, I was no longer just seeing things. The figure had come for me. And I had no idea how to stop it. Story 5. It was just an ordinary evening when I found it, the receipt. I had just returned from a long day at work, my mind still buzzing with tasks left unfinished. As I reached into my coat pocket, I pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. At first, I thought it was just another old receipt, perhaps from a forgotten purchase. But as I smoothed it out, my heart skipped a beat. The store name was unfamiliar, and I was certain I'd never set foot there. Yet the items listed, those items, were far from foreign to me. In black ink, there they were, a set of kitchen knives, a brand of headphones I'd been obsessing over, and a vintage-style lamp I had bookmarked online, still waiting for me to make the purchase. Even the receipt included a discount code I had only just noticed while browsing days ago. I stared at the paper, confusion gnawing at my insides. How could this be? I'd never been to that store, yet the list of items mirrored my deepest desires, things I had been quietly contemplating for weeks. My mind raced as I sank into the couch, the room suddenly feeling too still, too quiet. I flipped the receipt over, hoping for some explanation, something to make sense of it all. But there was nothing. Only a date and time stamp from the previous day. My breath caught. That couldn't be right. I hadn't gone shopping, hadn't bought anything online recently. The receipt defied all logic. I immediately checked my bank account, hoping to find some trace of a forgotten purchase. There was nothing. No charge. No record of a transaction at that store. I even called the customer service line, but when I mentioned the receipt, the woman on the other end sounded baffled. No record of me ever shopping there, she said, her voice polite but cold. She suggested it might be a mistake or a scam, but that didn't explain how the items listed were the exact ones I had been considering. The more I thought about it, the more unnerving it became. A sense of being watched crept over me, like someone had been inside my head, knowing my desires before I did. The receipt wasn't just a list of things, it was a map of my thoughts, laid out in black ink, a chilling reminder that I was no longer in control. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but how could it be? The knives, the headphones, the lamp, they were things I had thought about, things I had never spoken aloud or written down. I could see them in my mind's eye, as clear as day. I retraced my steps, compelled by an impulse I couldn't explain. I went to the store listed on the receipt, though I knew I had never been there. The building was tucked away between two other shops, nothing extraordinary. Yet as I stepped inside, an overwhelming sense of familiarity hit me. The shelves were lined with the same items, the knives, the headphones, even the lamp, all positioned just as they had been in my mind. A chill ran through me. I approached the counter, where a young woman was arranging merchandise. When I asked if she remembered me shopping there, she smiled, polite but distant. "Sorry, I don't recall seeing you before," she said. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. The air in the store felt wrong, heavy, as though I were walking through a dream I couldn't wake up from. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't place it. I left, still clutching the receipt in my hand, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Could it be a fluke? How could it be? The receipt was too specific, the items too aligned with my own thoughts. I felt as though something, someone, was drawing invisible lines between me and this strange, terrifying reality. That night, I couldn't sleep. The receipt haunted me, its mystery gnawing at my mind. I stared at it for hours, trying to make sense of it. It felt as though the receipt had been placed in my life by some unseen force, existing outside of time itself, waiting for me to understand its meaning. The next morning, I returned to the store, desperate for answers. But when I arrived, I was met with an empty storefront, a "For Lease" sign swinging in the breeze. My heart pounded in my chest. The store had vanished overnight. How was that possible? I turned the receipt over, my fingers trembling as I stared at the date and time stamp again. It was from the previous day, right in the middle of the afternoon, while I had been at work. There was no way I could have been there. No way I had made the purchase. Yet the receipt existed, and the items on it were things I had been considering for weeks, things I had never acted on. As I walked away from the empty storefront, a terrifying thought began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. I was caught in a loop, a pattern I couldn't escape. I didn't know who, or what, had placed that receipt in my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a mistake. It was real. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was being drawn into something far larger than myself, something I couldn't understand. But I was somehow bound to it, whether I wanted to be or not. Story 6. It was late one night, and I was lying in bed, mindlessly scrolling through my phone. That's when I saw it, an unfamiliar email with the subject line, "For your eyes only." A chill crept up my spine, a sense of dread settling deep within me. Something about it felt wrong. But curiosity got the better of me, and I tapped on the message. The email was unnervingly simple, no text, just a series of attachments. My heart pounded as I clicked on the first image. It was a photo of me, deep in sleep, taken from outside my bedroom window. The angle was too perfect, capturing me tucked under my covers in the stillness of night. My dimly lit room revealed every detail, details I hadn't realized were so visible from the outside. Panic gripped me as the realization hit, someone had been watching me. I opened the next picture, each click sinking me further into a nightmare. This one was a closer shot, zoomed in on my face, serene in sleep. The camera was positioned just outside my window, angled so carefully to capture me at my most vulnerable. I scanned the image frantically, no sign of the person who had taken it. It was as if they had been there, inches away from me, hidden in the shadows, watching me without a trace. I shut the phone, my throat tightening, my heart racing. How could they have gotten so close? I lived on the second floor, my window far from any ground-level access. I sat frozen, unable to comprehend what I'd just seen. This wasn't some prank, this felt calculated, sinister. I didn't want to look outside, but I knew I had to. The thought of checking the window made my skin crawl. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I could barely get the words out, explaining what had happened. They promised to send someone, but their calm reassurance only deepened my fear. What if they were still out there? Watching, waiting for me to slip up. The officer arrived shortly after, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he examined the area. He checked the window, finding no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt. Whoever did this was careful, he muttered, his tone heavy with suspicion. His advice was simple, keep the blinds closed and be vigilant. But no amount of caution could ease the terror that had taken root in me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the building, every gust of wind rattling the window made me jump. The images from the email haunted me, the feeling of someone lurking just beyond my door lingering like a weight on my chest. I locked every door, every window, but it did little to ease the storm of fear inside me. The next day, I went through the motions, still trapped in a haze, the images flashing in my mind at the slightest reflection or window glance. I felt eyes on me, even in public. It followed me everywhere. When I returned home that evening, hesitation gripped me before I even touched the doorknob. I checked the hallway, made sure no one was lurking in the shadows. Once inside, I rushed to my bedroom and pulled the blinds tight, the paranoia smothering me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. With trembling hands, I grabbed it, half expecting another email, another set of photos. But it wasn't. It was a message from a friend, checking in. I texted back quickly, not wanting to admit the nightmare that had become my life. The days that followed were filled with the same dread. Every time I passed a window, my heart would race, expecting to see someone watching, camera in hand. Then, one evening, just as I was preparing for bed, the dreaded email arrived again. My hands shook as I opened it, my pulse quickening. This time, there were no photos, just a single line of text, "I'm always watching." The words hit me like a punch, a cold fist of reality. Whoever was behind this knew everything about me, my routines, my fears. They were still out there, somewhere, waiting. I went to the police again, showing them the message. But once more, they had no answers. They told me to install cameras, be cautious. But their advice felt hollow. It didn't make me feel safe. It just reminded me that whoever was watching, they knew my every move. Days turned into weeks, and the fear never loosened its grip. I slept with a flashlight by my bed, checking the window every few minutes. I even thought about moving, but the thought of running from this felt like a hollow escape. I wanted answers, but every step I took only deepened the uncertainty. I don't know if I'll ever find out who was behind those emails or what they wanted. All I know is that I can never look at my windows the same way again. The fear of being watched, of being vulnerable in my own home, has seeped into my every waking moment. And with each passing day, the feeling only grows stronger, that someone is still out there, waiting for the next moment to strike. Story 7. I had always been wary of blind dates, but when my friends insisted I give it a shot, I reluctantly agreed. They promised it would be fun and assured me the person they set me up with was perfect for me. So, I showed up at the cafe, unsure of what to expect but willing to give it a chance. It didn't take long to spot my date, Mark, sitting at a corner table, his eyes glued to his phone. When he looked up, our gazes locked, and something about the intensity in his eyes made my skin crawl. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. I nodded, surprised by how quickly he knew my name. "I'm Mark," he continued, standing to greet me, and as I sat down, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that I knew him somehow. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. We exchanged pleasantries, but a strange déjà vu clung to the air like a shadow. As we talked, Mark guided the conversation in directions I didn't expect. He asked about my job, my childhood, even my last vacation. At first, I thought he was just a good listener or maybe had done his homework on me. But then the details became too specific, things I hadn't shared with anyone. "How was that trip to New York? I remember you told me about getting lost in Central Park," he said, his smile as though it was an old, fond memory. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone about that, not even posted anything on social media. How did he know? I forced a nervous laugh, brushing it off as coincidence, but the more we spoke, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was as if every part of my life was somehow known to him, in unnerving detail. "How's your sister doing?" he asked, catching me off guard. "You said she was thinking about moving to California." My mind raced. I couldn't remember ever telling him about that, let alone anyone. My pulse quickened, but I tried to maintain composure. "You really seem to know a lot about me," I said, my voice betraying the unease I was starting to feel. Mark simply smiled, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm a good listener," he said, as though that explained everything. But it didn't. How could he know these things? Things I hadn't shared with anyone, especially not on a first date. The conversation became more invasive, his questions digging deeper, like he was prying into parts of my life meant to stay hidden. "I've been following your career for a while now," he said, his voice lowering. "I saw your article about the charity event last year. You really have a way with words." The sincerity in his tone made my skin crawl. I had only shared that article with a few close friends. I looked around the cafe, searching for any sign that this was some kind of prank. Was I on hidden camera? But as I scanned the room, I saw nothing but normal patrons, no cameras, no crew. It was just me and Mark, and the longer I tried to make sense of it, the more it felt like he could read my thoughts. "You know," Mark continued, his voice dropping even further, "I remember when you started your new job last year. You seemed nervous, but I could tell you'd be great at it." My heart stopped. That moment, the first day of my new job, feeling more insecure than I ever had been something I'd never mentioned to anyone but my family. I felt trapped, my skin prickling with dread. No matter how I tried to redirect the conversation, Mark always had an answer, as though he had been watching me for years. He knew where I grew up, the schools I attended, even the names of my childhood pets. Each answer felt like a tightening noose around me, suffocating me. My smile was forced now, every fiber of my being screaming that something was wrong. The walls of the cafe felt as though they were closing in on me, and it was like we were the only two people left in the world. I couldn't take it anymore. "Excuse me," I said, standing abruptly. "I need to use the restroom." I walked quickly, heart hammering in my chest, feeling his eyes follow me. I glanced back, and sure enough, his expression hadn't changed. He was still watching me, and the thought that he might know exactly what I was thinking, what I was about to do, sent a shiver down my spine. In the restroom, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to steady my nerves. Was this a sick joke? Or was something far more sinister going on? When I returned to the table, Mark was still there, waiting patiently. He smiled when he saw me, but the air had shifted, he knew I was unsettled. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't think this is going to work." His smile faded, but he didn't seem angry. Instead, he nodded, as though he had been expecting this. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I'll see you again soon, won't I?" I didn't respond. My heart raced in my chest as I turned and left the cafe, glancing over my shoulder one last time. But Mark was already gone. The sense of him watching me, though, lingered, like an invisible presence trailing me all the way home. Story 8. I was in the attic, sorting through old boxes, forgotten keepsakes, forgotten memories, just trying to make sense of the clutter. I had recently moved into my new apartment, and the task of clearing up the mess was starting to feel overwhelming. Dusty photo albums sat stacked in front of me, their pages yellowed with age. As I flipped through them, one faded photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. I bent down to pick it up, but when I saw the image, my breath caught in my throat. The woman in the photo looked exactly like me. Same brown hair, same facial features, even the same slight tilt of her head and faint smile I often wore in photos. But there was something wrong. She was dressed in clothes from a decade ago, outdated, old-fashioned styles I'd never have chosen. The photo was grainy, the colors washed out, but there was no denying it. It was me, or at least, someone who looked exactly like me. My heart began to race. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stared at the photograph, trying to make sense of it. I flipped it over, hoping for some explanation. But there was nothing. No name, no date, no clue. Nothing that could tell me who this woman was or how she ended up in this album. My mind raced, desperately searching for any memory or event that could explain what I was seeing, but there was nothing. I had never seen this woman before, and I was certain I'd never worn clothes like that, not even years ago. The longer I stared at the photo, the more it seemed to blur and distort, as if it was pulling me into a reality I couldn't comprehend. I showed it to my friend Jenna, hoping for some clarity. "Isn't this bizarre?" I asked, holding the picture out to her. Jenna squinted at it before looking up at me, confusion in her eyes. "It's definitely you," she said, her voice low. "But those clothes, they look like something from your high school years, maybe. But I don't remember you ever wearing anything like that." Her words didn't help ease my growing sense of unease. I tried to recall anything from my past that could explain the photograph. I remembered high school, of course, but none of it connected to the woman in the photo. The more I thought about it, the more I realized, the woman in that photo wasn't how I remembered myself back then. I had always dressed casually, modern. The outfit she wore was more formal, almost like something from another time. But how could it be me if I didn't remember it? That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the photograph sat on my nightstand, taunting me. The mystery gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I kept drifting back to that image of the woman, someone who looked like me, yet wasn't. Was it just a coincidence, or was something deeper at play? The thought that someone could look exactly like me, yet not be me, filled me with dread. The next day, I took the photo to a local photographer, hoping he could shed some light on its age or origin. He examined it for a moment, then shook his head. "This photo looks like it was taken in the early 2000s, he said. "But I don't recognize the style or the type of film used. It's not something you'd see from the mainstream at that time." His words only deepened my confusion. If the photo was that old, why had I never seen it before? I searched my family's old albums, hoping to find some clue about the woman in the photograph. But nothing. I even asked my parents, but they were just as baffled as I was. "I've never seen her before," my mom said, furrowing her brow. "Are you sure this isn't a photo from one of your friends?" But I knew it wasn't. I'd never had a friend who looked like her. The more I thought about it, the more I felt that there was something deeply unsettling about this photo. Why was it in my album? What connection did I have to this woman? The more I searched, the more it felt like I was chasing a ghost, one I couldn't catch. One night, after hours of fruitless searching, I returned to the attic, desperate for answers. I opened the same box, sifting through the contents, hoping I'd missed something. And then, I found it. Another photograph. This one was different, a picture of a group of people at a party. But in the back, almost hidden in the shadows, was the same woman from the first photo. She was smiling, her face partly obscured, but it was definitely her. And then, I saw it. She was holding the same red scarf I had bought just a few months ago. My heart stopped. How could this be possible? How could this woman, who looked so much like me, be connected to a time I didn't even remember? The sense of unease intensified, and I knew that this was no coincidence. Somehow, I was linked to this woman, but how? Why? And whatever this connection was, it felt like something far darker than I could comprehend. The more I dug, the more I felt like I was digging myself into a hole I might never be able to climb out of. Story 9. One afternoon, I found myself sifting through old family videos, a task I'd put off for years. My parents had kept a dusty box of VHS tapes from the 90s, and I decided to transfer them into a neat digital collection before the memories faded beyond recovery. The footage was grainy and nostalgic, capturing birthdays, holidays, and random moments of family life. As I watched, I couldn't help but laugh at my younger self and the ridiculous fashion choices we all thought were cool. Then one video caught my attention. It was from a summer trip to a cabin in the mountains, a week spent hiking, fishing, and staying up late around campfires with my cousins. The video was filled with laughter, familiar faces, and warm memories, but something about it didn't sit right. As I scrubbed through the footage, a figure in the background caught my eye, and my stomach churned. At first, I chalked it up to a trick of the lighting or maybe my imagination, but when I rewound and watched again, the figure remained. A tall man, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, stood just outside the frame of our group shot. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his cap, but what struck me was how out of place he looked. None of us knew anyone like him, and we certainly hadn't invited anyone on our family trip. I froze the frame, my eyes fixed on the stranger in the background, and a chill crawled up my spine. The worst part wasn't just that he was a complete stranger, it was that none of us seemed to notice him. My family members were completely absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to his presence. He just stood there, motionless, watching us with an unsettling stillness, as if he was waiting for something. I rewound the video again, trying to figure out how I had missed him the first time. As I watched closely, I noticed even more disturbing details. He didn't seem to be moving. He was holding his position, locked in the background, almost as though he was waiting for the camera to catch him. A cold dread filled me as I tried to recall the trip. It had been a secluded cabin, miles from the nearest town. There had been no signs of other people during our stay, just my cousins, my parents, and me. So who was this man? And why was he in our video? I decided to show the footage to my parents, hoping they could shed some light on the mystery. But when I asked them about the man, their faces turned pale. They had no idea who he was either. My mom even mentioned that she had felt something was off about the trip, a strange unease that lingered in the air, but she had brushed it off at the time. They both insisted they remembered no one unusual being around, especially not someone who would appear in the background of our video. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why hadn't anyone noticed him? Why did he seem so out of place in a video filled with familiar faces and happy moments? I became obsessed, watching the video frame by frame, looking for any clues that might explain who this man was. His posture was unnervingly rigid, as if he were trying to stay hidden but somehow still visible. I zoomed in on his face, but the shadows from his cap made it impossible to make out any details. He was an enigma, a figure that simply didn't belong. Then, in one frame, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man had moved. Just a few steps closer to the group, though still far enough that no one seemed to notice. But the way he moved, so unnaturally smooth, was like he was gliding rather than walking. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. I tried to convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, maybe a local person had wandered into the frame, unaware of the camera. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This man wasn't accidental. He was deliberate, as if he was trying to insert himself into a moment he should never have been a part of. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the stranger haunted me, replaying in my mind. I kept thinking back to that trip, the secluded cabin, the eeriness that had clung to the place. Could it be that we weren't as alone as we thought? Could someone have been watching us, lurking just outside our view? The next day, I went back to the video, hoping to find some closure, some explanation that would make it all make sense. But when I fast-forwarded to the end, something was wrong. Instead of the final shot of the family waving goodbye, the video cut to a new scene, a scene I had never seen before. The camera now faced the empty driveway, and the man from the background had stepped forward, standing directly in front of the lens. For the first time, his face was visible. And it wasn't unfamiliar. It was mine. Story 10. I had always been uneasy about leaving Max at a kennel. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. But when I had to leave for a week-long work trip, there was no other choice. The kennel came highly recommended, and I visited several times to ensure it was a good place for him. I even took him there a few days early to help him adjust, hoping the transition would be as smooth as possible. But still, the thought of leaving him behind gnawed at me. The trip itself passed in a blur. Most of my time was spent in meetings, presentations, and a whirlwind of business. Yet, my mind often drifted back to Max, wondering if he was eating properly, if he missed me, if he was okay. Every evening, I checked my phone, anxiously waiting for updates from the kennel. Each time, I was reassured with brief but comforting messages. Max is doing well, he's adjusting just fine. Finally, when the trip came to an end, I couldn't wait to see my dog again. I hurried to the kennel, my heart racing with excitement. The familiar smell of dog food and cleaning supplies filled the air as I walked through the door. The sounds of barking echoed in the back, and I felt a surge of anticipation. The receptionist greeted me with a smile and handed me Max's leash. "He's been a good boy," she said, leading me down the hall to the back where the dogs were kept. As the door opened, I saw him. There he was, standing near his crate, his ears perked as he looked toward me. I called his name, my voice brimming with excitement. "Max." I crouched down, arms outstretched. But instead of bounding toward me like he always did, he hesitated. His tail remained still, and he just stood there, staring at me. A cold chill crept down my spine. I tried to shake off the sudden confusion. Maybe he's just disoriented, having been around so many other dogs and people, I thought. I called to him again, my tone soft and familiar. "Come here, boy, it's me." But he didn't move. Instead, he took a small step back, his eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear. Uncertainty. My heart pounded, the knot in my stomach tightening. This wasn't like Max at all. He had always been the kind of dog who would leap into my arms, tail wagging, every time he saw me. He'd never acted like this, not even when we'd been apart for weeks. The receptionist seemed to notice the change too. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. He's usually so excited to see his owner. He's been a little more reserved than usual since yesterday, but otherwise, he's been fine. I didn't know what to say. It was hard to believe that this distant, fearful creature was the same dog I'd loved for years. I stood there, helpless. I called his name again, but this time, he backed away further, almost as if he were afraid of me. A cold punch of dread hit me. I reached out slowly, trying to close the distance between us, but as my hand neared him, he flinched and pulled away. It was as though I had somehow hurt him. Maybe he's just confused after being here so long, the receptionist suggested, her voice trying to reassure me. It might take him a little while to adjust. I nodded, but the unease inside me continued to grow. Something was wrong, this wasn't just confusion. There was a look in Max's eyes that I had never seen before, a look of pure, unshakable fear. It was as if he didn't recognize me, or worse, as though he was terrified of me. I left the kennel, Max walking cautiously by my side, keeping a wary distance. Once we were in the car, I spoke to him in soft, soothing tones, trying to comfort him, but he wouldn't come near me. He sat on the passenger seat, his body rigid, eyes never leaving me as if he were waiting for something terrible to happen. The drive home was agonizingly quiet. I reached out to pet him several times, but each time, he pulled away. By the time we got home, I was desperate. I opened the door, leading him inside, but he hesitated at the threshold. He didn't rush in like he always used to. Instead, he stood there, his body tense, eyes darting around the room, as though searching for something unseen. I tried to coax him in, calling his name, but he refused to move. It felt like I was trying to bring a stranger into my house, not the dog I had raised and loved for years. A crushing sense of loss washed over me, like the bond we once shared had evaporated into thin air. I decided to give him some space, hoping that he just needed time to adjust. I set up his bed in the corner of the living room, and eventually, he went over to lie down. But even then, he still didn't seem entirely comfortable. For the rest of the evening, I watched him from across the room, hoping he would come to me, hoping he would remember me. But he didn't. Every time I tried to approach him, he pulled back, as if I were a stranger. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of, speaking to him in gentle tones, giving him treats, taking him for long walks, but nothing seemed to help. He was still afraid of me, still acting as though he didn't recognize me. I even went back to the kennel to ask if anything unusual had happened during his stay, but the staff insisted everything had been fine. They had no explanation for his sudden change in behavior. It felt like a nightmare. The dog I had loved for years, the dog who had always been by my side, had vanished. In his place was a terrified, confused stranger, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get him to come back to me. It was as though something had happened during his time at the kennel that had completely altered the way he saw me, or maybe even the way he saw the world. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had changed him, it was something I would never be able to fix.